Joining us live on the telephone, a very interesting woman who's written a fascinating book. It's called Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family, and written by his grandniece, Deirdre Capone, who has been traveling around the country doing a lot of book signings. And we just talked before we went on the air. She'll be coming down to Florida not too long into the future, but she joined us by telephone today from up in Minnesota. And Deirdre, thanks for being with us today. How are you?
Thank you, Doug. Oh, I'm very, very good. Thank you very much.
I'm glad we had a chance to set up a phone interview with you. I got the email from your publicist about it, and I've always been kind of fascinated with this kind of topic myself. So I appreciate you doing that. And first of all, congratulations. You were just telling me before we went on, the book is already a bestseller. So that's got to make you feel good.
It does make me feel good, and the feedback that I'm getting from people that read it, it's really good too. You know, no one else can write this book. There has been 100 books out there that have been written about my uncle, but no other author, none of those authors ever saw him, ever heard him, didn't have any knowledge about him at all. The research that they did was mainly going back and reading old newspaper articles and police blotters. Well, you all know how accurate newspaper articles are, don't you? So, the same false stuff gets, picked up again. I was born Deirdre Marie Capone in Chicago, Illinois, and it was a terrible burden to have that name for a lot of different reasons. And my dad couldn't take it, much like Bernie Madoff's son. He committed suicide just before my 11th birthday, leaving me with a lot of questions. And so my father was an only child. So my grandfather, who was Al's oldest brother and business partner, really started to tell me things. And he knew I was going to write a book one day, but he asked me not to write it until all the original family members had died. And I've kept my promise. But there are things about Al Capone, about the Capone family, that no one outside of the family knew. I mean, I saw my uncle laugh. I saw him, cry. He taught me funny things. One time when he was teaching me to play poker, he just laughed and laughed and laughed at me because he said, you can never play poker smiling. You've got to have a poker face. And, just things like that I knew about the man. At one point, my grandfather and my uncle ran 300 different businesses. They paid all the bills, everything worked, and they didn't have a cell phone or a fax machine.
Yeah, right.
They really were business geniuses.
I want to get into
people don't know about.
Yeah, I want to get into some of the stories that the book is titled Inside the Family, and there are some there that I want to hear about. But you just brought up a point there, and I've always thought about this myself, about gangsters, if you want to call it that, organized crime, whatever you want to call it. They were able to run businesses, and maybe still do to some extent today. Why couldn't they have used that talent in a legitimate business world? Couldn't they have made as much money, or probably more, doing that? I wonder if they ever thought about that. I guess not.
Well, they did. Let's take this way back. When my grandmother came over from Italy, and it was 1896 is when she came over, the Italians were the low people on the totem pole. All the teachers in school, complained. They said they smelled bad, they were greasy, they smelled of garlic. They just were not in a position where they were going to go to business school, be a lawyer, be a doctor, whatever. Their children had the opportunity, but they themselves, the first generation, didn't. Al Capone had a chance to go to Chicago to work for a man by the name of Johnny Torrio. Prohibition was really an unfair law. There's literally two people that convinced the United States Congress to outlaw alcohol. People wanted alcohol. people today, you know, at the end of a week, they like to sit down, have a beer, relax, whatever. So it was very unfair. So people throughout our nation either, you know, had their own stills. My mother's father made beer in his basement. So they were doing things like this. But there were certain business people in all the cities. It wasn't just Chicago. Chicago probably was the wettest town in the world.
Yeah.
But every single city, New York had their own organization. Philly had theirs. You know, Newark had theirs. Every single Detroit had theirs. These were people that would bring in alcohol so that people could be served in speakeasies. They could go out, they can, you know, dance, they can do things, and then they could drink alcohol in these establishments. So Al Capone wanted to bring good quality alcohol. So he would go out, he would go to Canada, he would go to Cuba, he would go to the Bahamas, trying to find the best quality liquor that he could bring. The leaders of other organizations in other cities would get together. They'd all meet. Like in Cuba was one of the favorite places for them to go together and meet. And Hot Springs, Arkansas were. All the boys would get together. They'd get in the baths. They'd play poker afterwards, and they would share information: where to get the best liquor, what, you know, the best prices, how to get it in from these places. You know, it's where you're not going to get hijacked and things like that. So it wasn't just Al Capone. There was an opportunity there for a lot of business-minded people to get into it. And, you know, it's what the people wanted. So my family was only into 3 enterprises: gambling, prostitution, and alcohol. All 3 of those things are legal somewhere today.
Do you think if there wasn't prohibition back then, organized crime obviously wouldn't have been as big, right? But do you think your uncle would have gone down that route?
Organized crime is something different. They never thought anything about this organized crime. My family, Al, my grandfather, thought about it as a business. They were providing things that people wanted. The only crime that ever occurred is when somebody broke the rules. Anybody that got into that business knew the rules. I equate that time in our history to the Wild West. In the Wild West, if you rustled somebody's cattle, you got killed. If you took somebody's woman, you got hung. You know, cowboys would line up at either end of the street and walk toward each other, and the first one to draw and shoot the other one won. The police, the politicians, and the mobsters all worked together to provide the people with what they wanted. And it worked well. You know, my grandfather told me there was enough business for everybody. There didn't have to be any problems. But there were, you know, Bugs Moran wanted more of business. You know, O'Donnell, you know, wanted more business, so they keep trying to get into, you know, other people's, you know, saloons and try to, you know, provide the alcohol to them. That was the only thing that was happening. In some of these other history books, they draw a connection to Al Capone to extortion. And I just want to tell everybody, Al Capone and the outfit, they were never involved in extortion. The people that did the extortion was an organization called the Black Hand Society, and they were experts in extortion. Since I've come out of the closet, people know who I am. I can't even begin to count the number of people who have come to me. Oh, my father owned a jewelry store, and he paid your uncle to protect them from the extortionists.
Interesting. Talking with Deirdre Capone. The name of the book is Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family. And you kind of bring up a point there, the history books. Probably more so people have an impression of Al Capone from, I guess, the show The Untouchables, probably a few movies before that. And since that, how much of that is accurate and how much is fiction?
And every time a producer gets a hold of a story, they try to put their own stamp on it. Just like an artist can paint, the Madonna's, face, and somebody else has already done it, and it's two different paintings, because of the way they interpret it. So everything that comes out of Hollywood has a little bit of a bend, a little bit of sensation, and of course, as we have progressed in our society, it seems like the more sensational it is, the more people like to go and see it. So they try to even make it more sensational. I can't change anybody's perception. I don't want to change anything, but I'd like to set the history book straight on a couple of very, very important things.
Sure.
Number one, Al Capone had nothing to do with the Valentine's Day Massacre. And I've got the proof in my book, and it's substantiated in 3 other different places. The second thing, the only thing that Al Capone was ever convicted of was income tax evasion. He was convicted for the same amount of money for the same years that my grandfather was. Al Capone was public enemy number 1. My grandfather was public enemy number 3. My grandfather served 3 years for it in a federal penitentiary. They sentenced Al Capone to 11. Al has been retried by the American Bar Association, and he's been found not guilty of all charges. But back then, they found him guilty. He was filing for a writ of habeas corpus when he was in Atlanta because his lawyers found evidence that the federal government tortured a witness so that he would lie on the witness stand. So Al was one day away from being taken out of Atlanta Penitentiary, taken back to Cook County, Illinois, to present this evidence before the judge. President Hoover found out about it. He called up Warden Johnson, who was the first warden of Alcatraz, and said, I want you to transfer Al Capone. And he did it for 2 reasons. Number 1, the media attention that he got. So it gave Warden Johnson a chance to tell newspaper reporters all over the world about this high security, maximum security prison that no one could escape from. The second reason that they transferred him is there is no writ of habeas corpus on Alcatraz. Alcatraz was a military prison, and back during the Civil War, President Lincoln removed the writ of habeas corpus from there because of the soldiers that were sent there for secession. He did not want them, to have a chance to get off of there. So anyway, they gave Al time off for good behavior. That's how they replaced the writ of habeas corpus. But when I go out to Alcatraz, one of the first signs you see is Alcatraz was created as a prison for men who were deemed irredeemable.
Right.
They could never return back to society. That was not Al Capone. Al Capone was only guilty of income tax evasion. But because the history books show that he was in Alcatraz, the public thinks that he was guilty of more things than he was.
Interesting. I know you were just out there doing a book signing. That must have been kind of, I don't know if you've been there before this particular trip. Was that eerie for you, or what was that like?
It is eerie, but I signed close to 1,000 books on
Wow.
the 4 days that I was out there. Yeah, they want me to come out over and over. Yeah, just think about Al Capone. When Al Capone was 27 years old, he literally owned the world. He could have had anything, and he did have things. Then, at 41, he was convicted of 42. He was convicted of income tax evasion. Then he was sent to Alcatraz. The cell is 6 foot wide, 9 foot deep, and they put him in a cell block where there was windows across the hall from him where he could see the downtown area of San Francisco and actually hear the people partying at night.
Wow.
It had to be torture for him. Torture.
I want to talk a little bit about his early life, which I didn't realize till I just read some of the notes on your site that he was born in New York. I didn't realize that. I thought he was born and raised in the Chicago area, but he was born, I believe, in Brooklyn, and then went to Chicago, as a teenager?
No, he went to Chicago in 1920, so he was 21 years
21,
old at that
okay.
time. That's when Johnny Torrio, he got into a scrape in New York, and so he thought it would be best to, leave town. He was married at the time, had a son, and Johnny Torrio, he called Johnny Torrio, and Johnny Torrio said, yeah, come on over. Then in 1920, in November of 1920, his father dropped dead of a massive stroke, leaving my grandfather, who was the oldest. He was born in Italy, and he was the oldest guy in a tight-knit Italian family, so he had to take over the father's role because there were still 5 siblings at home and a mother, and he also had a wife and a son. So Al called him and said, Ralph, if you come with, your business knowledge, we could really make a lot of money here. If that didn't happen, if my grandfather Gabriel did not die like that, I think the history of the Capone family would be much different. Because they're really good people. And, I have 4 children. I have 14 grandchildren. There has never been anything more than a speeding ticket that anybody has ever gotten. There's no bad DNA in this family. It is a good family.
He must have had, though, a command or a charisma, if you want to call it that people were drawn to rise to the top of the business world that he was in, obviously. He must have had something like that where he commanded that type of respect, right?
He really did. He was called, a businessman with the shoulder holster, He really did. He worked very well with my grandfather. My grandfather was not an out front person. Again, he was the oldest male. He needed to, keep the family together. He needed to assume the role of the father figure. So he didn't get that silly. Al was silly, and he would be out in front. He loved the limelight, and people did. You noticed him. You always noticed him. You didn't always notice my grandfather, but you always noticed him.
Did he dress?
I heard a story about him.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you are, how old you are, but do you remember Pall Mall cigarettes back in the 40s?
I'm not quite that age, but I do remember the commercials for them.
Do you remember the little dwarf?
That I don't remember, no.
And he had this, all right, there was this little dwarf, and he wore a red suit with the red hat, and he'd come out, Pall Mall, and he'd sing it. We're all here for Pall Mall. He worked for my uncle.
Did he really?
He worked for my grandfather. That's how he got that job.
Wow. Was Al Capone a natty dresser? You see some pictures of him. He looked like he was always with the suit and the hat and the overcoat. Was that important to him?
Very. The best cigars, the best hats, the best clothes, the best furs on his wife. Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, you get to see that's one thing probably that's kind of accurate in the television portrayals or movie portrayals. A lot of those men back then, they took pride in the way they looked. So I think that was one thing that's probably accurate. Talk a little bit about. Obviously you mentioned he was in jail for sentenced to 11 years in jail. Did he pass away in jail, Deirdre, or was he released before he passed away?
No, that's another myth. He was released from Alcatraz in 1939, and before he was released, somebody there called my grandfather, and they said that they had a new treatment for syphilis, and they wanted to try it out on Al. And that's where you started to hear that he was going crazy and he became violent and things like that. When he got grandmother was pregnant with me at the time. And she was there, and she said, Al would go up to her and say, "Who are you?" And then he would go to his brother and say, "Who are you?" Then he would go back, to his mother, "Who are you?" And go back to his brother. He kept doing this. He did not know anybody. So my grandfather told me he knew there was really a problem. So he found a doctor in Baltimore, Maryland, associated with the Johns Hopkins, and I talked to this psychiatrist's wife a couple of times. She verified everything my grandfather told me. What they did with my uncle is they were injecting him with mercury. And you'd all know, if you ever read Alice in Wonderland,
Sure.
There's a character in there called the Mad Hatter.
Mad Hatter, right.
And he went mad because he dipped his thread in mercury to sew these heavy headdresses. So they needed to get all those poisons out of his system, and they did. One thing about Alcatraz is the prisoners on Alcatraz had no name. All they had was their number. Anytime they were called, they'd have to give their number. They were called by their number. Number 86, you've got, visitors, stuff like that. When Al got out, he could not remember Alcatraz at all. Not a single thing about it, and he couldn't remember his number. They erased his memory.
Wow. I never heard that before. That's interesting.
It was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And another thing, people say, that he died of syphilis. No one dies of syphilis. Everybody back in those days had syphilis, men and women. My mother, before she passed, she had some dementia. They tested her for syphilis, and she did have the remains of it.
Really?
So, that was the roaring 20s. The women were taking off their corsets and doing, the flapper dances and stuff like that. So, it was, you didn't practice safe sex back then. So everybody had syphilis, but nobody died of it. So that's another thing. People think he died of syphilis. He did not. He did not die in prison. He died in his home in Miami on Palm Island, January 25th, 1947.
Okay.
So he was out of prison for 7 years.
Okay, I didn't realize it was that far after. You heard different stories. You didn't know what exactly the truth was, so that's interesting to find that out.
I know.
Yeah.
That's why I'm here.
That's right.
I'm 71 right now, and I've got to get this stuff out, and I'd like to talk to as many people as I possibly can to at least tell them, some of the errors that have been made in the history.
We just have about a minute left with you, Deirdre. The reaction you've said has been great so far. Obviously, with the name of Capone, do people still feel a prejudice against that name, or is that kind of past now, from your perspective?
There are some people. I am a golfer, and I'm at this golf club. And when I came out of the closet and people, knew who I was, there are a couple of people that will not play golf with me.
Really? Wow.
Yep.
So it still lingers a little bit today. That's too bad.
But, they don't know. They believe all these allegations. Were there people killed? Yes. Did Al Capone do it? I don't know. But, there was more bloodshed in the newspaper industry than there ever was in the liquor industry. The newspapers and the police killed more people than anybody in Al Capone's outfit.
Well, it's a fascinating topic, and the book is filled with these great stories. It's called Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family. We've been talking with Deirdre Capone. And Deirdre, you have a website people can get a hold of the book and maybe send you an email or contact you if they'd like.
The book is available in all the bookstores, also online at barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com. I do have a website, unclealcapone.com. You can also reach me at 855, which is a toll-free number, 855-AL-CAPONE. I know there's an extra digit in there, but it will go through and people can talk to me on that line.
Great. Well, Deirdre, appreciate you taking some time to be with us tonight, and really look forward to perhaps meeting you sometime next time we're down here in Florida. And thanks for being with us. It's a great topic.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners